Just a few days ago, Nintendo released the latest installment of one of its most beloved and venerated series, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. The game is the much anticipated sequel to the highly acclaimed Breath of the Wild, released for both the Wii U and the Switch in 2016. To commemorate Tears of the Kingdom's release, I figured this would be a great time to go back and cover the life cycle of its older brother. In late 2011, Nintendo had just released the last Zelda title for the Nintendo Wii, that being The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. While the game did some interesting things like utilize a unique art style based on Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters such as Claude Monet and Paul Cézanne, and blurring the lines between the overworld and dungeons in regards to its gameplay structure, the game received a rather lukewarm reception, both critically and commercially, with sales falling well below expectations, selling a bit over 3.5 million units. Less than half the sales of the previous game in the series, Twilight Princess. Because of this, Nintendo's developers decided the next game in the series would require some drastic changes. Zelda veteran and series producer Eiji Aonuma stated, "Our mission in developing this new Zelda game for the Wii U is plainly to rethink the conventions of Zelda. I'm referring to the expectation that the player is supposed to complete dungeons in a certain order, or that you're supposed to play by yourself. The things we've come to take for granted recently. We want to set aside these conventions and get back to the basics and create a newborn Zelda so that the players can best enjoy the real essence of the franchise." So the Zelda team began work. Breath of the Wild would be yet another Zelda where development would be once again led by another Zelda mainstay, Hidemaru Fujibayashi. Fujibayashi had a long history of directing Zelda titles. Formerly an employee of Capcom under one of their subsidiary studios, Flagship, Fujibayashi directed the Game Boy titles Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, as well as the Minish Cap for the Game Boy Advance. Apparently impressing Nintendo with his work, they decided to welcome him into the fold, becoming a proper Nintendo employee, and shortly thereafter letting him helm development for Skyward Sword as his first Zelda as an in-house director. With Skyward Sword failing to light the charts on fire, Fujibayashi had his work cut out for him. And so the direction the Zelda team decided to take would come to be the most drastic and revolutionary transformation the series would undergo since the transition from 2D to 3D, though ironically, in order to achieve this revolution, the developers would actually go back 30 years to take inspiration from the very first Zelda that started it all. The original Legend of Zelda, while establishing many of the characteristics and traits for all future Zeldas, was also quite unique in that it was the Zelda that had probably the greatest sense of freedom. Afterwards, pretty much all subsequent Zeldas would have a more confined and restricted sense of gameplay, meaning that many of the main objectives would be done in a very specific order, with very little, if any, ability for the player to stray. By contrast, the original Zelda had more of an open world type structure, and this is what the Breath of the Wild team desired, a vast 3D open world Hyrule. To help get started, the developers would create a 2D prototype done in the style very fittingly of the original Zelda. The game would start proper development in January of 2013. The game's art style would be utilizing a modified version of the cel shading tech from another Zelda title, The Legend of Zelda: Wind Waker on the GameCube. Breath of the Wild, however, would come to have more of an anime-inspired appearance that was more reminiscent of a Studio Ghibli film. Like a lot of people, I had my issues with Wind Waker's art style back in the day, but as time went on, it started to grow on me, to the point where I really appreciate it, even though I feel it's not perfect. That being said, going in a similar direction of Wind Waker was a good choice on Nintendo's part, and personally, I think Breath of the Wild has by far and away the best visual design in the series, improving on Wind Waker's and being vastly superior to Skyward Sword's aesthetic. The art team also took inspiration from Japan's Jomon period, as there wasn't a lot of information for that era, and that it would be a good fit for the Shikan relic architecture and technology. Director Fujibayashi used his hometown Kyoto as inspiration for the landscapes in the game, and those landscapes would be absolutely massive. Breath of the Wild's game map is by far and away the largest Zelda map to date. While there's no official reported numbers by any of the Zelda developers, some very enthusiastic and clever fans did a little bit of math and provided us with what can be the closest unofficial measurements. YouTuber RX Gaming calculated that having Link jog from the southernmost point to the northernmost point in Breath of the Wild took a little bit over 28 minutes, and traveling from east to west took about a little over 33 minutes. For comparison, when he did the same thing going from south to north in Twilight Princess, it took him about 12 minutes. According to an article from Mashable, Imgur user Distify calculated the size of several Zelda maps. Ocarina of Time's map was a mere 0.2 square miles, Twilight Princess's 1.7 square miles, while Breath of the Wild was a whopping 23.7 square miles. Heck, just one area of the game, the Great Plateau, was roughly half the size of Ocarina's entire map. As if all that wasn't already impressive enough, Breath of the Wild's map managed to surpass even the colossal overworld of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which comes in at 15.1 square miles. Breath of the Wild would also be revolutionary in one other regard. This would be the first Zelda game in the series' history that would actually have voice acting. Yes, for the first time ever, most of the characters would actually have audible speaking roles, though the game's main character, Link, would still remain the silent protagonist, which I personally find to be the correct decision. I'm sorry, I just don't think the world is ready yet for a Link that talks.
Well, excuse me, princess.
Given Skyward Sword's relatively disappointing performance, Fujibayashi no doubt must have been on pins and needles awaiting how well Breath of the Wild would do. Luckily for him, any trepidation he might have had would dissipate fairly shortly, because Breath of the Wild would perform far better than anybody on the Zelda team, anybody within Nintendo in general, hell, anyone on the planet would have anticipated. The game turned out to be a massive hit on a scale hitherto undreamt of.
Did you seriously just say hitherto undreamt of?
So I just want to point out something real quick. There's this thing in finance called the attach rate. An attach rate in the context of video games is the relationship between the number of consoles sold and the number of units of a particular video game sold. Got it? Good. I mentioned this because it's kind of important. So in the first month of sales in the US, Nintendo and the NPD Group, a marketing research firm that tracks video game sales, reported that 906,000 units of the Switch were sold, along with 920,000 units of the Switch version of Breath of the Wild. Yes, you read that right. There were actually more copies of Breath of the Wild sold for the Switch than there were Switches to play it on. Breath of the Wild managed to make history by becoming the first game ever to have an attach rate of over 100%. Not even Super Mario 64, probably the biggest launch game of all time, managed to achieve anywhere near that feat. Though Nintendo did offer a plausible explanation, which was that a large number of people probably bought a limited edition version to collect and a standard version to play. Regardless, it's still an impressive achievement. In Japan, however, the game had a much less impressive showing, selling 230,000 units between both the Switch and the Wii U versions. However, luckily for Breath of the Wild and Nintendo, the slow start was made up by its really long legs. It would go on to sell slowly but consistently as time went on. And like the tortoise from that story we all read as kids, slow and steady would eventually win the race. Because by September of 2018, Breath of the Wild would do the unthinkable. It had finally surpassed the previous best-selling Zelda in Japan, Ocarina of Time, passing 1.25 million units. And as of the latest numbers that we have from Japan, the game nearly doubled those numbers and currently sits at 2.17 million units. Also around the same time in 2018, the game sold over 10 million units worldwide, and it continued to sell steadily over the years. In fact, in the final 9 months of 2022, the game had sold another 2.4 million copies. When all was said and done, Breath of the Wild would sell over 30 million units as of uploading this video. To put this in perspective, this was over 3 times as many units as the previous best-selling Zelda, Twilight Princess, managed to achieve. And it was a massive reversal from the extremely lukewarm numbers that its immediate predecessor, Skyward Sword, managed, not even being able to crack 4 million. And as if all that wasn't impressive enough, Breath of the Wild did what no other Zelda in history managed to accomplish, and that was actually surpassing the sales of a mainline Super Mario title. Indeed, its Switch sibling Super Mario Odyssey, while performing quite admirably itself, only managed to sell slightly under 26 million units. And as if that wasn't impressive enough, Breath of the Wild also managed to achieve the nearly incomprehensible feat of selling not just better than Mario, but the other Nintendo juggernaut, Pokemon, by beating Pokemon Sword and Shield for the Switch as well. Currently, it's also well above the most recent Pokemon title, Scarlet and Violet. However, those just came out a couple of months ago, so time will tell if they'll eventually surpass Breath of the Wild's total. Okay, it's pretty clear that Breath of the Wild was phenomenally successful, but the question remains, why was it so successful? Yes, Zelda has always been one of Nintendo's best-selling franchises. However, Breath of the Wild performed in far excess of any Zelda title before it. So why exactly was that the case? Why this Zelda specifically? Well, let's get one obvious explanation out of the way, and that's the fact that the Switch itself is staggeringly successful. And even that might be an understatement, given that it's the third best-selling gaming system of all time at a whopping 125 million units as of this upload. So of course Breath of the Wild will be able to sell a lot better when there are more consoles to actually play Breath of the Wild on. Now, as far as how the merits of the game itself contributed to its success, I believe there were three major factors: size, freedom, and potential. So let's talk about size. Most Zeldas tend to be fairly big games, chock full of content that can keep people entertained for a good while, several weeks at least. However, after some diligent playtime, a player could probably complete all side quests and minigames and unlock basically every secret in the game within a month at most. On the other hand, as mentioned earlier, Breath of the Wild absolutely dwarfs any of its predecessors in size and scope. Just based on how colossal the landscape of the game is alone, gives players much more to explore and discover, keeping them busy far longer than any prior Zelda. And that's just simply running about the game's world. When you add in all the side quests and mini-games and shrines, of which there are over 120, you have a Zelda that will keep a player preoccupied for a very long time. Next up, freedom. Breath of the Wild was the first open-world Zelda since the original on the NES. No longer were players constrained to follow a linear path from dungeon to dungeon. Now they could traverse the world however they felt like, exploring any temple, visiting any town, meeting any person at their own discretion. In fact, if a player wanted to, they could actually immediately go directly to fight the final boss right at the start of the game. Of course, that probably wouldn't be the wisest of decisions. After all, sometimes one has to think that just because one can do something doesn't mean one should do something. Still, as Anthony Birch of Destructoid writes, nearly everything in Breath of the Wild is optional. That in itself is revolutionary. There is an unfortunate philosophy among many game developers that if they worked really hard on something, then the player must see it. That if the player didn't experience something, then it is inherently wasted work. You don't have to beat any of the divine beasts. You don't have to solve a single puzzle in the game if you don't want to. You don't even need to get the friggin' Master Sword. And finally, the final factor in Breath of the Wild's success, potential. Arguably the number one reason for the game's success and longevity might just be due to its incredibly innovative physics system. Based off a modified version of the Havok physics engine, the Zelda team created a sandbox so advanced and complex that it made other highly regarded open-world games seem almost primitive in comparison. Though actually physics engine might be a little bit of a misnomer, at least according to the Breath of the Wild developers. They prefer to call it a chemistry engine, the distinction being that while a physics engine focuses on calculating movement, a chemistry engine would focus on calculating states. What does that mean? Well, for example, the way wood or grass would react when coming in contact with fire. Or when, say, fire reacts when exposed to water. These are of course very simple examples. However, when combined in a world as vast and interactive as Breath of the Wild's, the possibilities expand greatly. Director Fujibayashi describes it as an active, multiplicative gameplay. When the player's diverse actions and objects in the landscapes react in certain ways, they're multiplied together, where countless different events occur where the player can freely create solutions. And the developers were able to go about this by trying to connect everything in the world. As series producer Eiji Aonuma stated, "I really think the implementation of this physics engine is a major development for the Zelda series. The way the physics engine underpins everything in the world really offers up a lot of new possibilities. For instance, in Breath of the Wild you might have a puzzle where making use of the physics, there will be various ways you can solve that puzzle. That really opens up a lot of possibilities. So there's not just one way to progress in the game, or just one way to solve a puzzle." Indeed, the complexity and robustness of the system allows for a virtually infinite set of opportunities for experimentation. As Chris Dring of Eurogamer writes, "Unlike previous Zelda titles, Breath of the Wild enabled players to explore and to tackle challenges however they saw fit, with an array of new gameplay mechanics. This type of emergent gameplay has led to thousands of YouTube videos, articles, streams, and clips of players doing crazy things in the game. As new people have come into Nintendo Switch and started looking for a game to buy, or rather another game to buy after Mario Kart, Zelda is still a game being discussed, shared, and recommended. Indeed, here we are more than 6 years later, and the Breath of the Wild scene appears to be as vibrant as ever, with countless Zelda fans still uploading videos to YouTube with ever-growing exploits and discoveries. Breath of the Wild wasn't simply the most ambitious and impressive Zelda title when it came out, it was one of the most ambitious and impressive video games in existence. And I personally can't wait to see how Tears of the Kingdom expands and improves upon the brilliance of its big brother."